Story 1. Last signal. I should have turned around the moment I heard those bells. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am a bush pilot who has flown over the Alaska range for 15 years. I've seen things up there that would make your blood freeze, but nothing prepared me for what happened during my final flight 3 weeks ago. It started as a routine supply run to a research station near Tahkeetna. The weather was clear, visibility perfect. I was flying my Cessna 180 at about 8,000 feet when my radio crackled with static. Through the noise, I heard something impossible. The faint sound of bells, like the kind you put on pack animals. I checked my instruments. Everything was normal. The static cleared, and I convinced myself it was interference from the research station below. But then I saw them. 4 men in red uniforms, trudging through the snow on a ridge about 2 miles north of my planned route. Even from that altitude, I could see their exhaustion. They moved like men walking through quicksand, each step a monumental effort. One was leading what looked like horses, though the distance made it hard to be certain. I banked left for a closer look. The Alaska range is unforgiving wilderness. Finding people out there without proper winter gear meant rescue or recovery. As I descended, something made my skin crawl. The men weren't dressed for modern conditions. Their uniforms looked vintage, like something from an old photograph. The radio static returned, stronger now. Through the white noise, I heard a voice, male, desperate, speaking with a Canadian accent. Day 14. Lost contact with Fort Steele. Henderson is showing signs of frostbite. We must press on. I grabbed my radio. Unknown party, this is Cessna N2847 Delta. Do you require assistance? Static answered back, but underneath it, those bells kept ringing. When I looked down again, the men were gone. Just empty snow and pine trees. I circled the area 3 times. No tracks, no disturbed snow, nothing. I should have continued to the research station. Instead, curiosity pulled me toward a clearing where I spotted what looked like smoke rising from the trees. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I'd never been good at listening to instincts. I landed on a frozen lake about a quarter mile from the smoke source. The silence was absolute except for my engine cooling and the whisper of wind through the pines. I grabbed my emergency kit and hiking boots, telling myself I could just take a quick look. The trees grew thick here, their branches heavy with snow that never seemed to melt completely. As I hiked toward the smoke, I noticed something odd about the forest floor. There were impressions in the ground, like old tracks preserved under layers of pine needles and frost. But these weren't from modern boots. They were deeper, rounder, the kind made by leather soles and horseshoes. The smoke was coming from a campfire that shouldn't exist. It burned in a perfect circle of stones, the flames dancing without any visible fuel. The fire was warm, recently tended, but there were no footprints around it. No equipment, no sign of whoever had built it. I knelt beside the fire ring. The stones were arranged with military precision, each one exactly the same distance from the center. Carved into one of them were initials, RH 1910. Below that, barely visible, were the words, God help us. The radio static returned, louder now, coming from everywhere at once. I pulled out my handheld unit, but it was dead. The sound was coming from the forest itself, as if the trees were broadcasting the signal. Through the static, I heard multiple voices now, different men, all speaking with the same desperate urgency. Day 18. Peterson didn't wake up this morning. The horses won. He moved. They sensed something. We were walking in circles. The compass spins like a child. This toy. Something is following us. Always just out of sight. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The temperature was dropping fast, though my watch said it was still afternoon. The sky above the canopy had turned an unnatural shade of gray, like old pewter. That is when I saw him. A man in a red serge uniform stood about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive pine. He was watching me with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the living world. His face was gaunt, cheeks sunken with starvation and cold. Frost clung to his mustache and eyebrows like cobwebs. I wanted to call out, to offer help, but something about his stillness stopped me. He wasn't breathing. The vapor that should have been rising from his mouth and nose in the frigid air simply wasn't there. The figure raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest. Then he turned and began walking away with that same exhausted gait I'd seen from the plane. I followed, though every rational part of my brain screamed at me to run back to the Cessna. The trail led through increasingly dense timber. The tracks in the ground grew fresher, more defined. I could see where horses had struggled through deep snow, where men had stumbled and fallen. The path wound deeper into the range, following ridgelines and valleys that seemed to exist in permanent twilight. After what felt like hours, I emerged into another clearing. Here, the full scope of the horror became clear. 4 men sat around another campfire, their backs to me. They wore the same red uniforms, the same antiquated gear. Their horses stood nearby, heads hanging with exhaustion. The animals' ribs showed through their winter coats, and their eyes held the same lifeless quality as their riders. I approached slowly. "Hello, are you all right?" None of them turned around. None of them acknowledged my presence. But they kept talking, their voices carrying with unnatural clarity in the thin air. "We should have stayed at Fort Steele. The maps are wrong. This territory doesn't exist. Henderson has been dead for 3 days, but he keeps walking with us. We're not lost. We never were. This is where we were meant to end up." I circled around to see their faces and immediately wished I hadn't. Their eyes were gone, replaced by hollow sockets filled with snow. Their mouths moved, but the words came from everywhere except their lips. Frostbite had claimed their fingers, their noses, their ears. They were mummified by the cold, preserved in their final moments of despair. The one who had been speaking about Henderson turned his empty sockets toward me. "You shouldn't have followed us, pilot. Now you part of the patrol." I ran. Pure animal panic sent me crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my jacket, snow filling my boots. Behind me, I could hear them following, not walking now, but moving with purpose. The sound of their bells grew louder, more insistent. I burst through the tree line near where I had left the plane, but something was wrong. The lake was still there, still frozen, but my Cessna was gone. In its place sat a small camp with canvas tents and equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. A mounted police guidon snapped in the wind, the red and gold fabric bright against the gray sky. The radio static filled my ears again, but now I understood. It wasn't interference. It was their last transmission, broadcast on repeat for over a century, bouncing off the mountains and trapping anyone who got too close. I backed away from the camp, but there was nowhere to go. The 4 figures emerged from the forest behind me, moving in formation. Their empty eye sockets tracked my movement with impossible precision. The horses followed, their hoofbeats ringing like funeral bells. "Day 1, said the voice that had been Henderson. "Lost contact with Fort Steele. Weather turning. We must press on." I found myself walking toward them, though I didn't remember making the decision to move. My legs carried me forward against my will. The cold was seeping through my jacket, my boots, my gloves. With each step, I felt more of myself slipping away. That is when I understood the truth. The lost patrol of 1910 hadn't disappeared. They were still here, still making their rounds, still following orders that would never end. And now they had a new recruit. The last thing I remember clearly was putting on the red serge uniform they offered me. It fit perfectly, though it should have been a century too small. The brass buttons were warm against the cold, and the relief of finally stopping, finally resting, was overwhelming. 3 weeks later, I walked out of the Alaska range. Somehow, I made it back to civilization, though I don't remember the journey. The rescue teams found my plane exactly where I left it, undisturbed. My logbook showed I completed the supply run without incident. According to all official records, nothing unusual had happened. But I know the truth. Every night, I hear those bells. Every morning, I check my uniform for brass buttons that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, in the mirror, I catch glimpses of empty eye sockets where my reflection should be. The lost patrol is still out there, still following their final orders. Still recruiting new members for a journey that will never end. They waiting for the next pilot, the next hiker, the next person foolish enough to follow the sound of bells in the Alaska wilderness. I'm telling you this story as a warning. If you ever find yourself flying over the Alaska range and hear static on your radio, turn around. If you see figures in red uniforms trudging through the snow, fly the other direction. If you hear bells ringing in the wilderness, whatever you do, don't follow them. Because once you join the patrol, you never really leave. You just keep walking forever through snow that never melts and cold that never breaks. waiting for the next lost soul to hear your bells and follow you into the endless, frozen dark. The patrol is still out there, and now, so am I. Story 2. Phantom sentinels of Site Summit. The radar dish still turns, even though it was disconnected 40 years ago. I discovered this impossible fact during my third night as a security contractor at the abandoned Nike missile site on Site Summit, high above Eagle River. The rusted metal structure groaned against the mountain wind, rotating slowly in mechanical patterns that should have been impossible without power. But there it was, sweeping across the star-filled Alaska sky like a blind eye searching for threats that no longer existed. The state of Alaska had hired me to monitor the site while they decided whether to preserve it as a Cold War monument or demolish it entirely. Simple enough work for decent pay, or so I thought when I took the contract. Just me, a trailer, and the ghosts of America, this nuclear anxiety perched on a desolate mountaintop. Site Summit had been built in the late 1950s, one of dozens of Nike missile installations designed to defend against Soviet bomber attacks that never came. For nearly 2 decades, 125 servicemen had lived and worked on this frozen peak, their fingers perpetually hovering over buttons that could have launched nuclear-tipped interceptors into the Arctic sky. When the threat diminished and technology evolved, the military simply walked away, leaving behind a maze of concrete bunkers, rusted equipment, and something else I was only beginning to understand. The first sign that something was wrong came during my initial survey of the facility. I had been walking the perimeter fence when I heard the unmistakable sound of boots marching in formation somewhere behind me. The rhythm was precise, military, 20 or more men moving in perfect synchronization across the gravel paths between buildings. But when I turned around, the compound was empty except for the wind and my own footprints in the thin layer of snow. That should have been my warning to leave. Instead, I convinced myself it was just the mountain playing tricks with sound, the way wind and architecture can create auditory illusions in isolated places. I had worked security at remote locations before, and strange noises were part of the job. What I could not explain away so easily was the feeling of being constantly watched. Every moment I spent at Site Summit, I felt invisible eyes tracking my movement. The sensation was so strong it raised the hair on my arms and made me check over my shoulder dozens of times each day. It was not the casual observation of wildlife or the paranoid imagination of someone spending too much time alone. This was the focused attention of trained sentries, the kind of surveillance that military personnel develop after months of standing watch in hostile territory. The bunkers were the worst. Built deep into the mountainside, these concrete chambers had housed the actual missiles and their support equipment. They stretched into darkness that my flashlight could barely penetrate, filled with the remnants of a war machine that had waited decades for orders that never came. Every footstep I took in those tunnels seemed to echo far longer than physics would allow, as if the sound was being carried through hidden passages by unseen listeners. On my 4th night, I heard the alarms. They started just after midnight, a piercing wail that seemed to come from every direction at once. The sound was exactly what you would expect from a 1960s military installation under attack, designed to wake sleeping soldiers and send them racing to their battle stations. But the alarm system had been deactivated when the base closed, its speakers removed, its control panels stripped of their components. I ran from my trailer toward the main command bunker, following protocols I did not even realize I knew. The sound was so urgent, so convincing in its mechanical panic, that every instinct told me to respond as if the base was under genuine threat. Only when I reached the bunker entrance and found myself staring at empty mounting brackets where sirens had once been installed did the impossible nature of what I was hearing finally register. The phantom alarms continued for exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds, then cut off with the same abruptness they had begun. The silence that followed was somehow more disturbing than the noise itself, pregnant with the expectation of explosions or aircraft that would never materialize. I stood there in that terrible quiet, my heart hammering against my ribs, finally beginning to understand that Site Summit had never truly been abandoned. Research became my obsession over the following days. I dug through military records, newspaper archives, and Cold War histories, searching for any clue that might explain what I was experiencing. What I found was a story of psychological pressure unlike anything I had ever imagined. The men stationed at Site Summit had lived for years under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. They had trained endlessly for a war that would have lasted minutes and killed millions. Every day they had awakened knowing that their success or failure could determine whether American cities survived or burned. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the isolation of mountain duty and the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, had created a unique form of psychological trauma. Several servicemen had suffered nervous breakdowns during their tours at the site. Others had requested transfers after reporting hallucinations, insomnia, and severe anxiety attacks. The military records were heavily redacted, but I found enough evidence to suggest that the psychological casualties at Site Summit had been significantly higher than at comparable installations. More disturbing were the accounts I discovered from the final months before the base closure. Multiple reports described incidents of equipment operating without authorization, personnel reporting for duty shifts that did not exist, and sentries challenging invisible intruders during their watch. The commanding officers had attributed these events to the stress of impending decommission. But reading between the lines, it seemed clear that something had gone fundamentally wrong with the psychological atmosphere at the site. The phantom footsteps became a nightly occurrence. Always the same pattern: the measured cadence of soldiers moving between duty stations, the scrape of boots on concrete, the subtle sounds of equipment being checked and rechecked by men who no longer existed. Sometimes I would hear voices, too faint to understand but carrying the unmistakable tone of military communications. Orders being given, reports being delivered, the constant chatter of a functioning military installation that had been silent for 4 decades. What frightened me most was how natural it all began to feel. After 2 weeks at Site Summit, I found myself falling into routines that matched the phantom activities around me. I would wake at 05 hours without an alarm, conduct security patrols at precisely the times when the footsteps were most active, and feel a strange sense of purpose that had nothing to do with my actual job responsibilities. It was as if the site itself was training me to become another sentinel, another watcher scanning the horizon for threats that existed only in the collective memory of men who had died believing they were all that stood between civilization and nuclear destruction. The psychological residue of their vigilance had soaked so deeply into the mountain that it continued to function without them, an automated system of fear and preparedness that could not be shut down. The climax of my experience came during a blizzard that trapped me on the mountain for 3 days. The storm hit with typical Alaskan fury, dumping snow faster than the access road could be cleared and knocking out both power and radio communication to the valley below. I was completely isolated, dependent on a generator for heat and completely cut off from the outside world. That was when the Site Summit that existed in 1962 came fully to life around me. The phantom sounds intensified until they seemed almost solid, filling the air with the bustling activity of a military base at high alert. I could hear vehicles moving between buildings, though none existed. I could hear the mechanical sounds of missile systems being prepared for launch, though the silos had been filled with concrete decades ago. Most terrifying of all, I could hear the controlled panic in voices that discussed radar contacts and flight paths and countdown sequences for weapons that could have ended the world. On the second night of the storm, I made a discovery that changed everything. While exploring one of the deeper bunkers to escape the phantom noise above, I found a section that was not on any of the blueprints I had been given. Hidden behind what appeared to be a supply closet was a narrow passage that led to a small room deep in the mountain. The room contained a single desk, a chair, and filing cabinets full of psychological evaluation reports dating from the final year of the base operation. What I read there explained everything and made it infinitely worse. The commanding officer had known that his men were experiencing mass hallucinations. He had documented incident after incident of soldiers reporting activities that could not be verified, equipment operating without explanation, and a growing sense that the base was haunted by its own purpose. But instead of seeking help or requesting reassignment for his personnel, he had made a different choice. He had decided that the psychological symptoms were actually a form of enhanced readiness, a state of hypervigilance that made his men more effective at their jobs. In his final reports, he described his intention to maintain this condition indefinitely, to keep his soldiers in a state of perpetual alert that would make them the perfect Cold War sentinels. He believed he had discovered a way to create the ideal military unit, men so focused on their mission that they would continue to serve even beyond the limits of normal human endurance. The last entry in his files was dated 3 days before the official closure of the site. In it, he expressed confidence that his experiment had succeeded, that he had created something that would outlast the Cold War itself. He wrote about sentries who would never abandon their posts, soldiers who would maintain their watch regardless of political changes or military reorganizations. He had achieved, in his own twisted words, the perfect military unit. Reading those files in the depths of that concrete tomb, surrounded by the sounds of phantom soldiers maintaining their eternal vigilance, I finally understood what Site Summit had become. It was not just haunted by the men who had served there. It was infected by their commander's vision of perfect military dedication, a psychological virus that continued to recruit new sentinels from anyone who spent too much time on the mountain. I was becoming one of them. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The routines I had adopted, the sense of purpose I felt, the way I had begun to see the valley below as something that needed protection from threats I could not name. It was all part of the same psychological conditioning that had claimed 125 soldiers 40 years earlier. The mountain was turning me into another phantom sentinel, another watcher who would never leave his post. I ran from that bunker and did not stop until I reached my truck. The storm was still raging, but I drove down that mountain road in near whiteout conditions, risking my life to escape what I now understood was a fate worse than death. Behind me, I could hear alarms sounding again, calling me back to duty, summoning me to join the Eternal Watch. I never returned to Site Summit, though I know others have. The state eventually decided to preserve it as a historical monument, and I have seen photographs of tour groups and military historians visiting the site. I wonder if any of them have stayed too long. I wonder if any of them have heard the footsteps in the snow or felt the weight of invisible eyes tracking their movement across the compound. Most of all, I wonder if the Phantom Sentinels are still recruiting, still seeking perfect soldiers for a war that ended before it began. Because sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear those alarms calling me back to my post on the mountain. And the most terrifying thing of all is how much I want to answer that call. The radar dish still turns, even though it was disconnected 40 years ago. And somewhere on that frozen peak above Eagle River, 125 soldiers continue their watch, waiting for orders that will never come, scanning the sky for threats that exist only in the collective nightmare of the Cold War. They are the Phantom Sentinels of Site Summit, and they are always recruiting. Story 3. Uninvited guest at the Whittier window. The faceprint on my window was still warm when I found it at 3 in the morning. I pressed my palm against the glass where the greasy outline of lips, nose, and forehead had fogged the surface from the outside. The heat radiating through the window made no sense. It was negative 20 degrees in the Whittier blizzard, and anything pressed against that glass should have been frozen solid within seconds. But this mark pulsed with body heat, as if someone had just pulled their face away moments before I discovered it. Living in baggage towers means you get used to weird things. When your entire town of 200 people lives in a single 14-story building, connected to the outside world by just one tunnel through the mountain, strange becomes normal pretty fast. But this was different. This was something that made my skin crawl in ways I had never experienced during my 5 years in this concrete fortress we called home. I had moved to Whittier for the isolation. After my divorce and the mess that followed, I needed somewhere I could disappear completely. A place where nobody would ask questions and the outside world felt like something that existed only on television. The former military housing building provided exactly that kind of anonymity. Just me, my apartment on the 8th floor, and the endless Alaskan winter pressing against me. The scratching had woken me first, not the usual sounds of wind against glass or ice forming on the building exterior. This was deliberate, rhythmic, like fingernails dragging across the surface in patterns. I had assumed it was debris caught in the storm, maybe a piece of metal siding that had torn loose from somewhere. But when I looked out to check, that was when I saw the figure. It stood perfectly still in the swirling snow about 30 feet from my window, completely unbothered by the blizzard that was dumping inches of powder every hour. The shape was human, definitely human, but something about its posture was wrong. Too straight, too rigid, like a mannequin that had been placed in the snow and abandoned. What I could see of its face through the storm was pale, almost luminous against the dark winter night. The most unsettling part was how it stared directly at me, not searching the building or scanning the windows randomly. It was looking right into my apartment with the kind of focused attention that made every survival instinct I possessed scream warnings. I ducked away from the glass and waited, counting to 10 before looking again. It was gone. The snow showed no sign that anyone had been there, no footprints leading to or away from where the figure had stood. No disturbed powder, no depression in the accumulation. Just smooth, unmarked snow stretching across the field between my building and the tree line. But that faceprint on my window proved I had not imagined what I witnessed. I told myself it was a trick of the storm. Bad visibility, weird lighting from the building exterior, my brain trying to make sense of random shapes in the blowing snow. People see things during Alaskan winters. The isolation and darkness play tricks on your mind, but I could not explain away the mark on the glass, still radiating warmth like a brand burned into the surface. The next morning brought no answers. I examined the area below my window from the ground level, but the continuing snowfall had covered any evidence that might have existed. The other residents of Baggage Towers went about their business as usual, and I decided not to mention what I had seen. In a place like Whittier, reputation mattered. Nobody wanted to be known as the guy who was losing his grip on reality. But the incidents continued. 3 nights later, the scratching woke me again. This time I was ready. I had positioned a chair near the window and kept a flashlight within reach. When the sound started, I crept to the glass and peered out into the storm without turning on any lights that might give away my presence. The figure stood in exactly the same spot as before. Same rigid posture, same pale face turned toward my window, same complete indifference to the brutal weather. But now I could see more details that made my blood run cold. Its clothes were wrong for the temperature, thin and inadequate for the sub-zero conditions. Its hair moved in the wind, but the rest of it remained perfectly still, as if the lower half of its body was anchored to the ground. I clicked on the flashlight and aimed the beam directly at the figure. For just an instant, the light illuminated features that were almost human but not quite right. The proportions were off, the skin too smooth, the eyes too large and dark. Then it was gone again, vanishing between one blink and the next, leaving no trace in the snow except for that same warm face print on my window. This pattern repeated every few nights throughout the winter. The scratching would wake me. I would find the figure standing in the same location, and it would disappear the moment I tried to get a better look. Each time, a new face print would appear on the glass, always warm, always perfectly clear despite the storm conditions outside. I began documenting everything: times, weather conditions, any variations in the figure, its appearance or behavior. What I discovered made the situation even more disturbing. The appearances followed no predictable schedule, but they always occurred during the worst weather. The figure only showed up when the wind was howling and the snow was falling so heavily that visibility dropped to almost zero. More unsettling was the realization that the face prints were getting clearer. The first few had been vague impressions, barely visible marks that could have been explained as condensation patterns. But as the winter progressed, they became more detailed. I could make out individual features, the texture of skin, even what looked like breath marks around the mouth area. The worst part was what happened when I tried to clean the marks away. The glass cleaner would remove the visible residue, but the warmth remained. Hours after scrubbing the window spotless, I could still feel heat radiating from the exact spots where the face had been pressed. It was as if something had burned its impression permanently into the glass itself. I started researching the history of Baggage Towers in Whittier, looking for any explanation that might make sense of what I was experiencing. What I found was a story of isolation so complete that it bordered on the surreal. The town had been designed as a military installation during World War II, built to be completely self-sufficient in case of siege or nuclear attack. When the military abandoned it, the civilian population that remained inherited a fortress mentality that had never really gone away. But the more I dug into local records and newspaper archives, the more I realized that Whittier had a history of strange incidents. People reported seeing figures in storms, unexplained marks on buildings, and a persistent sense that the town was being watched by something that did not belong there. Most of these reports were dismissed as cabin fever or the psychological effects of extreme isolation, but the consistency of the accounts was troubling. One story in particular caught my attention. In 1987, a resident of Baggage Towers had reported seeing someone standing outside during a severe blizzard. When security checked, they found no person but discovered a perfect set of footprints that began and ended in the middle of an open field with no connecting trail. The prints were deep and clear, as if someone had materialized in place, stood for a while, then vanished without taking a step in any direction. The description matched what I was seeing perfectly. But that incident had occurred on the opposite side of the building from my apartment, and the reports had eventually stopped without explanation. Either the phenomenon had moved, or the previous witness had simply given up trying to document something that defied rational explanation. As winter deepened, my encounters with the figure became more frequent and more intense. The scratching grew louder, the face prints more detailed, and the sense of being watched extended beyond the nighttime appearances. I began to feel observed even during daylight hours, as if something was studying me from a distance I could not detect. The breaking point came during a particularly severe storm in late February. I had been awakened by scratching so loud it sounded like someone was trying to claw through the glass itself. When I looked outside, the figure was not in its usual position. Instead, it stood directly beneath my window, pressed against the building wall in a location that should have been impossible to reach. The face looking up at me was no longer pale and indistinct. It was clear, detailed, and completely raw. The features were human but arranged in proportions that created an impression of terrible hunger. The mouth was too wide, the eyes too deep, and the expression carried a need so desperate it seemed to radiate through the glass like heat. For the first time, the figure moved while I was watching. It raised one arm and pressed its palm against the window directly below where my face appeared on the other side of the glass. The sound was not the tap of flesh against solid surface. It was more like meat hitting meat. Soft and wet and intimate in a way that made me stumble backward from the window. When I gathered the courage to look again, the figure was gone. But this time, it had left more than just a face print. There was a complete handprint on the glass. Fingers spread wide, palm pressed flat against the surface. And around the edges of the print, I could see what looked like condensation from breath, as if something had been panting against the window with desperate exertion. The warmth from this mark was so intense it was uncomfortable to approach. Standing 3 feet away, I could feel heat radiating from the glass like a small furnace. But what terrified me most was the realization that the handprint was on the inside of the window. Whatever had made that mark had somehow reached through the glass without breaking it. That was when I understood that my situation had moved beyond strange into something genuinely dangerous. Whatever was visiting me had found a way to partially manifest inside my apartment. The barrier between its world and mine was dissolving, and I had no idea what would happen when it finally broke through completely. I packed that same night and left Whittier before dawn. The tunnel through the mountain had been plowed clear, and I drove through it without looking back. But even now, 3 years later, I sometimes wake up to the sound of scratching against glass. And when I check my windows, no matter what city I am living in, I sometimes find face prints that are still warm to the touch. The figure from the Whittier snow has followed me. It stands in storms, waiting and watching, pressing its impossible face against any glass that separates me from the outside world. The prints it leaves are getting clearer, more detailed, more real. And I have begun to suspect that what I encountered in that isolated tower was not a ghost or hallucination, but something far worse. It was something that feeds on isolation, that grows stronger in places where people are cut off from the world. Something that learned to manifest by studying the loneliness of residents trapped in concrete towers, surrounded by endless winter. And now it has attached itself to me, following my isolation wherever I try to hide from it. The face print on my window was still warm when I found it at 3 in the morning. And tomorrow night, when the storm hits this new city I call home, I know it will be warm again. Because some things you cannot escape, no matter how many tunnels you drive through or how many miles you put between yourself and the place where they first found you. The uninvited guest at the Whittier window has become my permanent companion, and it is getting hungrier with each visit. Story 4. Buckner Building. As hungry echoes, my digital recorder captured something feeding in the darkness, and I still have not found the courage to delete the file. I was 3 hours into exploring the abandoned Buckner Building in Whittier when my equipment picked up the sound. Wet, rhythmic chewing echoed through the concrete corridors of what locals call the city under one roof. But there were no animals inside that massive military structure. No rats, no birds, nothing living that could make those sounds. Just me, my camera, and whatever was hunting through the rotting remains of America, the strangest ghost town. The Buckner Building had been my obsession for months. As a YouTube urban explorer, I specialized in abandoned places with dark histories, and this 14-story concrete fortress represented the ultimate prize. Built during World War II to house thousands of soldiers in the remote Alaskan wilderness, it had been designed as a completely self-contained city. Everything a person needed to survive was supposed to exist within those walls. Shops, theaters, restaurants, even a jail and more. When the military abandoned it in the 1960s, they simply walked away and left everything behind. 50 years of neglect had turned the building into a maze of collapsed ceilings, flooded basements, and rooms filled with debris that crunched underfoot like broken bones. The asbestos warnings plastered on every entrance were just the beginning of the dangers inside. What worried me more were the stories from other explorers who had attempted to document the interior. Every account mentioned the same thing: The overwhelming sensation of being hunted. Not watched, not followed, but actively pursued by something that moved through the building with predatory intelligence. Most urban explorers lasted less than an hour inside before their nerves gave out completely. The few who stayed longer brought back recordings that contained sounds no abandoned building should make. I had dismissed these reports as typical ghost story nonsense until I heard the audio files myself. Faint voices pleading for help from empty rooms. Footsteps that followed explorers through corridors. And underneath it all, a sound like something large dragging itself across concrete floors, always just out of sight but getting closer with each passing hour. My plan was simple. Spend 12 hours inside the building, document everything, and prove that urban legends could be explained by natural causes. I brought professional recording equipment, multiple cameras, and enough battery power to last the entire night. What I did not bring was backup or any way to contact the outside world once I entered that concrete tomb. The first few hours went exactly as expected. The interior was a photographer's nightmare of decay and destruction. Water damage had warped floors into treacherous slopes. Mold covered the walls in patterns that looked almost like faces when caught in the right light. Debris filled most rooms to chest height, making progress slow and exhausting. But the building was not silent. Even in areas where I was completely alone, I could hear activities in distant sections. Creaking that sounded like footsteps. Scraping noises that suggested furniture being moved. Occasional thuds that reverberated through the concrete structure like massive heartbeats. I explained it all away as settling damage, thermal expansion, or debris shifting in areas weakened by decades of weather exposure. Old buildings make noise. That was basic urban exploration knowledge. But my recording equipment was picking up sounds that my rational mind could not categorize so easily. The electronic voice phenomena started during my 4th hour inside. I was documenting a collapsed dining hall when my audio recorder began capturing whispered words in the empty air around me. The voices were faint, barely audible above the ambient noise of the decaying building, but they were unmistakably human. Help me, please help me, I cannot get out. The pleas came from different directions, different voices, as if multiple people were trapped somewhere in the building and calling for rescue. But when I searched the source of each voice, I found only empty rooms filled with debris and shadows. The voices would stop the moment I entered a space, then resume once I moved on to another area. More disturbing was the pattern I began to notice. The voices always seemed to be leading me deeper into the building, toward sections that were more damaged and dangerous. Each plea for help came from slightly farther down a corridor or up a stairwell that led to areas I had not yet explored. It was as if something was using the voices to lure me into the parts of the building where escape would be most difficult. That was when I first heard the dragging sound. It started as a distant scraping, barely noticeable over the ambient sounds of the decaying structure. But as I moved through the building, the noise grew closer and more distinct. Something heavy was being pulled across concrete floors, leaving what sounded like wet trails behind it. The sound had a rhythm to it, like footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too slow, too deliberate, as if whatever was making it could not lift its feet properly off the ground. I tried to rationalize it as debris settling or water dripping in unusual patterns, but my equipment was picking up additional sounds that accompanied the dragging. Breathing that was too deep and too wet to be human. Occasional grunts of effort that suggested something was working very hard to move through the building. And underneath it all, that chewing sound I had captured in my recording. The hunting sensation hit me during my 6th hour inside. It was not paranoia or imagination brought on by spending too long in a creepy environment. This was a primal recognition that I had become prey, the same instinct that keeps deer alive in forests full of predators. Every hair on my body stood up, and my heart rate spiked as if I had suddenly found myself in mortal danger. Something was tracking me through the building. I could feel its attention like a weight pressing against my back, could sense its presence even when I could not see or hear it directly. It knew where I was at all times, knew which rooms I had visited and which corridors I planned to explore next. And it was positioning itself accordingly, like a spider moving through its web to intercept trapped prey. The voices became more urgent as I tried to find my way back toward the exit. Instead of distant pleas for help, they became direct commands issued from the darkness around me. This way, over here, hurry, before it finds you. But the voices were leading me away from the exit, deeper into the sections of the building that had suffered the most structural damage. I realized that whatever was speaking was not trying to help me escape. It was trying to drive me towards something else that waited in the depths of the concrete maze. I abandoned my exploration plan and focused entirely on getting out. But the building had changed during the hours I spent inside. Corridors I remembered as clear passages were now blocked by debris that had not been there before. Stairwells I had used to reach upper floors were suddenly impassable, filled with rubble that looked like it had been deliberately placed to cut off my retreat. The dragging sound was getting closer. I could hear it clearly now, accompanied by labored breathing that echoed through the corridors like the panting of an exhausted animal. But there was something else in that breathing, something that suggested intelligence and hunger rather than mere animal desperation. My camera caught movement in my peripheral vision, and I spun around to see something disappearing around a corner at the far end of a hallway. It was large, definitely human-sized, but it moved in a way that was fundamentally wrong. Instead of walking, it seemed to pull itself along the floor, dragging its lower body behind it like it was injured or partially paralyzed. I followed, knowing it was exactly what the thing wanted me to do, but unable to resist the compulsion to see what I was dealing with. The trail led to a stairwell that descended into the basement levels of the building, areas that had been flooded for decades and were considered too dangerous for exploration. At the top of the stairs, I found the first piece of evidence that I was not dealing with a natural phenomenon. Deep gouges had been carved into the concrete steps, as if something with metal claws had been dragging itself up and down the stairway for years. The scratches were fresh, cutting through layers of rust and mold to expose clean concrete beneath. More disturbing were the stains that accompanied the claw marks. Dark, rust-colored patches that looked suspiciously like dried blood, but in quantities that suggested something much larger than a human being had been bleeding on those stairs. The stains formed a trail that led down into the flooded basement, where my flashlight beam disappeared into black water that reflected nothing. I should have left immediately. Every rational thought in my head was screaming at me to get out of the building while I still could. But my recording equipment was picking up new sounds from the basement, sounds that made me understand what I was really dealing with. Feeding sounds. Wet, enthusiastic chewing accompanied by satisfied grunts of pleasure. Something down in that flooded darkness was eating, and from the sounds it was making, it was enjoying its meal immensely. That was when I realized what had happened to all the other urban explorers who had attempted to document the Buckner Building over the years. The ones who had disappeared without explanation. The ones whose equipment was never found, whose videos never made it to the internet. They had not left. They were still in the building, in the basement, providing sustenance for something that had been trapped in that concrete tomb since the military abandoned it decades ago. The feeding sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it made my ears ring. Then I heard movement in the water below, slow and deliberate, as if something very large was rising from the depths of the flooded basement and beginning to climb the stairs toward me. I ran. The building fought me every step of the way. Doors that had been opened slammed shut as I approached them. Corridors that had been clear filled with debris that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The voices started screaming at me from every direction, no longer pretending to be pleas for help but revealing themselves as the hungry cries of something that had been feeding on urban explorers for decades. Behind me, I could hear the dragging sound getting closer, accompanied by breathing that was no longer labored but excited, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey after a long hunt. Whatever was following me up from the basement was moving faster now, driven by the prospect of fresh food after what might have been months of waiting in the flooded darkness. I made it out by abandoning all my expensive equipment and crawling through a window that had been too damaged to notice during my entry. The glass cut my hands and arms, but I barely felt the pain through my terror. I did not stop running until I reached my car, and I did not stop driving until I had put 50 miles between myself and that hungry concrete tomb. The recording I mentioned at the beginning of this story contains 12 hours of audio from inside the Buckner Building. Most of it is exactly what you would expect from an abandoned structure. Settling sounds, wind, debris shifting. But scattered throughout those 12 hours are sounds that should not exist in any empty building. Voices pleading for help that lead explorers deeper into danger. Dragging sounds that follow a clear pattern of predatory stalking. And most disturbing of all, feeding sounds that suggest something has been living in that basement for decades, sustained by urban explorers who thought they were brave enough to document the city under one roof. I have never returned to Whittier, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night when I am editing video in my studio, I hear that dragging sound and the ambient noise of other abandoned buildings. It reminds me that some places should stay abandoned, that some urban legends exist because the truth is too terrible to speak aloud. The Buckner Building is still there, still hungry, still waiting for the next explorer who thinks they are brave enough to spend 12 hours documenting its dark history. My advice is simple. Let someone else be the hero. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some recordings should never be made. Because once you have heard something feeding in the darkness, you never really stop listening for it. Story 5. Prophet of the campus shuttle. The voice in my ear knew my grandmother was dying before I did. I was sitting in the back row of the campus shuttle, half asleep during the morning ride from my apartment to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, when someone whispered directly into my left ear. The words were so clear, so intimate, that I could feel warm breath against my skin as they were spoken. Your grandmother's going to die, and you are going to miss your economics test. I jerked upright and spun around to see who had spoken. The seat behind me was empty. In fact, the entire back section of the bus was empty except for me. The other passengers were scattered throughout the front half, most of them staring at their phones or dozing in the early morning darkness. None of them were even looking in my direction. The driver was focused on navigating the icy roads that connected the student housing complex to campus. His radio crackled occasionally with dispatch communications, but he had not spoken to anyone since I boarded 20 minutes earlier. There was no way anyone could have whispered those words without me seeing them. But I had heard them as clearly as if someone had been sitting right next to me. The voice was neither male nor female, carrying a strange quality that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly into my brain. More disturbing than the possible delivery was the content of the message itself. Why would anyone, real or imaginary, tell me such specific and terrible things? My grandmother lived in a nursing home in Anchorage, 300 miles south of Fairbanks. She had been in declining health for months, but her condition was stable according to the last update I had received from my mother 2 weeks earlier. There was no reason to expect any sudden change, certainly nothing that would happen on this specific Tuesday morning in February. The economics test was real enough. Professor Martinez had announced it the previous Friday, and I had spent most of the weekend studying supply and demand curves instead of enjoying the brief respite from Fairbanks winter weather. But missing it would be catastrophic for my grade, and I had never missed an exam in my 3 years of college. I tried to convince myself that I had been dozing and the words were just fragments of a stress dream brought on by test anxiety and worry about my grandmother. College students hear voices all the time during final season. Sleep deprivation, caffeine overload, and academic pressure create all kinds of mental glitches that feel real but mean nothing. But the voice had been so clear, so certain. It had not sounded like my own internal thoughts or random dream imagery. It had sounded like information being delivered by someone who knew exactly what was going to happen and wanted to make sure I knew too. The shuttle arrived at campus right on schedule. I gathered my backpack and joined the stream of students filing off the bus into the brutal February air. The temperature was 20 below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, but I barely noticed as I walked toward the economics building. My mind was still focused on those impossible words and the terrible certainty with which they had been delivered. My phone rang as I was climbing the steps to the lecture hall. The caller ID showed my mother's number, and my stomach dropped before I even answered. She never called this early unless something was wrong. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. My grandmother had suffered a massive stroke during the night and was being moved to intensive care. The doctors were not optimistic about her chances of recovery. My mother was driving up from Anchorage to be with her, and she wanted me to come home as soon as possible. I stood on those concrete steps in the killing cold, staring at my phone screen long after the call had ended. The voice on the shuttle had been right about the first part of its prediction. My grandmother was dying, exactly as it had said she would be, which meant the second part was probably going to come true as well. I called my economics professor and left a voicemail explaining the family emergency. Professor Martinez was understanding when he called back, offering to let me take a makeup exam the following week. But the damage was already done. I had missed the test, exactly as the voice had predicted. 2 perfect predictions delivered by an impossible source. The rational part of my mind insisted it had to be coincidence, but the timing was too precise and the details too specific. Someone or something had known what was going to happen to me that day, and they had made sure I knew it too. The question that haunted me during the flight to Anchorage was why. If something supernatural was capable of delivering accurate prophecies, why would it choose to torment a random college student with advance notice of personal tragedy? What was the point of knowing my grandmother was going to die if there was nothing I could do to prevent it? My grandmother passed away 3 days later without regaining consciousness. I spent those final days sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her hand and thinking about the voice that had prepared me for this moment. In a strange way, I was grateful for the warning. Instead of being shocked by my mother's phone call, I had been mentally ready for the news. The voice had given me time to process what was coming. But that gratitude was mixed with a growing fear about what else the voice might know. If it could predict my grandmother's death and my missed exam with perfect accuracy, what other events in my future might it be aware of? And more importantly, would it choose to share that information with me again? I got my answer on the shuttle ride back to campus after the funeral. I was sitting in the same seat where I had heard the first prediction, lost in grief and exhaustion from the difficult week. The bus was nearly empty in the post-funeral afternoon, just me and a couple of other students making the routine trip from off-campus housing to the university. That was when the voice returned, speaking with the same impossible intimacy as before. Your roommate is stealing from you, and you are going to fail organic chemistry. This time I was ready for it. I spun around immediately, checking every seat and corner of the bus for any possible source of the words. But once again, I was alone in the back section, and no one else appeared to have heard anything unusual. The voice had delivered its second set of predictions and vanished without leaving any trace of its presence. The roommate situation was something I had suspected for weeks. Small amounts of cash had been disappearing from my desk drawer, and I had noticed that my laundry detergent and other supplies were being used up faster than my own consumption could account for. But I had been avoiding confronting my roommate about it, hoping I was wrong and not wanting to create conflict in our shared living space. Organic chemistry was a different story. I was struggling in the class, but I had not been expecting to fail outright. My grades were low but still passing, and there were several weeks left in the semester to improve my performance. The predictions seemed less certain than the others, more like a warning than an inevitable fact. But the voice had been right about everything so far. If it said I was going to fail organic chemistry, then I probably was, regardless of how hard I might study or how well I might perform on future exams. The predictions seemed to carry their own weight of certainty, as if speaking them aloud somehow made them true. I spent the following weeks testing the accuracy of the voice's latest prophecies. I set up a small camera in my room and caught my roommate going through my belongings while I was at class. The theft was confirmed with video evidence that showed him taking money from my wallet and using my personal items without permission. Organic chemistry proved more complex. My performance in the class continued to decline despite increased studying and extra help from teaching assistants. It was as if the prediction had created its own psychological pressure that made focusing on the material impossible. Every time I sat down to study, I could hear those words echoing in my mind. You are going to fail organic chemistry. The voice returned twice more that semester, always on the shuttle, always delivering personal predictions with perfect accuracy. It told me about a minor car accident that would delay my arrival at a job interview, costing me a position I had been counting on. It warned me about a friendship that would end badly when I discovered a close friend spreading rumors about my family, his financial situation. Each prediction came true exactly as described, usually within days of being delivered. But the accuracy of the prophecies brought no comfort, only a growing sense that my life was being observed and manipulated by something that understood the future in ways I could not comprehend. The most disturbing aspect was the personal nature of the information. The voice did not predict world events or random occurrences. It focused exclusively on details of my own life, intimate knowledge that should have been impossible for any outside observer to possess. It knew about my relationships, my academic struggles, my family dynamics, and my private fears with a precision that suggested constant surveillance. But by whom or what? I researched everything I could find about prophetic experiences, supernatural voices, and unexplained phenomena. Most of the accounts I found described vague impressions or cryptic messages that could be interpreted multiple ways. None matched the specific, practical predictions I was receiving about mundane aspects of my daily life. The voice seemed less interested in providing mystical guidance than in demonstrating its intimate knowledge of my future. Each prediction felt like a test, a way of proving that whatever was speaking to me had access to information that should have been unknowable. The final prediction came during my last week as a student at UAF. I was transferring to a different university for my senior year, partly to escape the psychological weight of living with prophetic knowledge I could not control or understand. As the shuttle pulled away from campus for the last time, the voice delivered its most chilling message yet. You will never escape me, and you will never stop listening for me. That was 3 years ago. I finished my degree at a different school, moved to a different state, started a career in a different field. But the voice was right, as it always was. I have never escaped it, and I have never stopped listening for it. Every time I ride public transportation, every time I sit alone in a quiet space, every time I find myself in situations that remind me of those shuttle rides in Fairbanks, I strain to hear that impossible whisper in my ear. Sometimes I think I catch fragments of new predictions, hints about future events that make my heart race with familiar dread. The voice has not returned with the same clarity as those college days, but I know it is still there, still watching, still knowing things about my future that I cannot see. And someday, when I least expect it, it will whisper another perfect prediction directly into my ear, reminding me that some knowledge comes with a price that can never be fully paid. The prophet of the campus shuttle gave me glimpses of my own future, and now I can never stop wondering what else it might know. Story 6. Persistent man of Knack Neck. The doorknob turned slowly at 3 in the afternoon while my wife was alone, recovering from surgery, and I was 200 miles away. I am telling you this because some people don't understand how isolated Alaska really is, how a simple Craigslist ad can invite nightmares into your life when the nearest help is hours away and winter darkness lasts 20 hours a day. We lived in Knack Neck, population 400 on a good day, where everyone knows everyone and strangers stick out like blood on fresh snow. My wife Sarah and I had moved there for my job with fish and wildlife, managing salmon runs during the summer season. It was supposed to be peaceful, a place where you could leave your doors unlocked and trust your neighbors to watch out for each other. The car was nothing special, a 2015 Toyota Corolla with high mileage that had served us well through 2 Anchorage winters before we relocated. But Knack Neck had no use for a small car built for city driving. We needed something with 4-wheel drive and ground clearance, so I posted the Toyota on Craigslist for $3,500. Figured we'd sell it quick and put the money toward a used truck. The first call came within hours. A man, his voice, soft-spoken but oddly intense, asking detailed questions about the car. Where had we bought it? Who was the previous owner? Had there ever been any accidents, even minor fender benders? He wanted to know things that seemed irrelevant to a potential buyer, like what routes we usually drove and where we parked it overnight. I gave him the basics and offered to show him the car, but he said he was traveling and would call back. Something about his tone made me uncomfortable, but people in rural Alaska can be eccentric. Living in isolation does things to social skills that city folks don't always understand. The calls kept coming, every day, sometimes multiple times, always the same soft voice asking new questions or repeating old ones. He wanted to know our work schedules, when we'd be home to show the car, whether we had security cameras or burglar alarms. The questions got more personal over time, shifting from the vehicle to our living situation, our backgrounds, why we moved to such a remote location. After a week of calls, I told him the car wasn't available anymore. Made up a story about deciding to keep it for winter backup. But the calls didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. Now he was asking why I changed my mind, whether someone had made a better offer, when we might reconsider selling. That is when the notes started appearing. Folded pieces of paper tucked under our windshield wipers, slipped through our mail slot, left on our front porch. Always the same careful handwriting asking about the car, offering to pay cash, providing phone numbers that went to disconnected voicemails when I tried calling back. The notes included details about our daily routines that no stranger should have known. What time I left for work, which grocery store Sarah preferred, the names of our neighbors. Sarah found the first note inside our unlocked car, placed carefully on the driver's seat. That meant someone had been close enough to open our vehicle and leave a message while we slept 20 feet away. In a town of 400 people, everyone notices strangers, but no one had seen anyone unusual hanging around our property. The notes escalated quickly from polite inquiries to demanding explanations. Why wouldn't we sell? What were we hiding? Had we lied about the car's condition or history? The handwriting remained neat and controlled, but the content grew increasingly aggressive and entitled, as if we owed this person something beyond a simple business transaction. I removed the Craigslist ad and blocked the phone number, but new numbers kept calling. Different area codes, but always the same soft voice asking the same probing questions. I started recognizing his speech patterns, the way he paused before asking particularly invasive questions, how he seemed to derive satisfaction from making us uncomfortable. 3 weeks into this harassment, I had to fly to Anchorage for a mandatory training conference. 4 days away from home, leaving Sarah alone in our isolated house while she recovered from knee surgery that had left her mobility severely limited. She could walk short distances with crutches, but running or defending herself was impossible. I arranged for our neighbor Jim to check on her daily and left detailed instructions about keeping doors locked and calling the village public safety officer if anything unusual happened. Knack Neck, SVPSO, was a good man, but he covered territory larger than some states and might be hours away responding to any emergency. Sarah called me on the second day, voice tight with fear. The man had been to the house, not just driven by or left another note, but actually approached the building and tested the door handles. She'd been napping on the couch when she heard footsteps on the front porch, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone trying to turn the doorknob. The door was locked, but the handle jiggled persistently for several minutes while she lay frozen on the couch, afraid to move or make any sound that might confirm someone was inside. Then the footsteps moved around the house to the back door, more testing of locks, more deliberate attempts to find an unlocked entry point. When the knocking started, it was gentle at first, polite tapping that gradually became more insistent pounding. The man called out in that same soft voice from the phone calls, saying he knew someone was inside and he just wanted to talk about the car. He claimed there had been a misunderstanding and he was willing to pay more money if price was the issue. Sarah managed to crawl to the bedroom window and glimpse him through the curtains. Middle-aged, average height, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Nothing distinctive except his absolute confidence in violating someone else's property and privacy. He moved around the house like he belonged there, checking windows and testing locks with methodical thoroughness. The worst part was when he sat down on our back deck and made himself comfortable. Not hiding or trying to avoid detection, but settling in like he had every right to be there. Sarah could hear him moving around, occasionally talking to himself or making phone calls at a voice too quiet to understand the words. When Jim came by for his daily check, the man was still there. Jim confronted him, asking what he was doing on private property. The man calmly explained that it was his house, had been for years, and these people were trespassing on his land. He spoke with such conviction that Jim later admitted he momentarily wondered if there had been some mistake about property ownership. Only when Jim threatened to call the state troopers did the man finally leave, walking to an older pickup truck parked on the road about a quarter-mile away. But he didn't drive off. He just sat there, engine off, watching our house through binoculars for the rest of the afternoon. I caught the next flight home, but by then the man had disappeared. The truck was gone, no more notes appeared, and the phone calls stopped completely. For 3 days, everything seemed normal again. Sarah began sleeping without her crutches next to the bed, and I started thinking the worst was over. Then I found him parked at the end of our road when I came home from work. Same truck, same man, but now he was watching our house with professional patience. Not hiding, not trying to be sneaky, just openly conducting surveillance of our daily activities. When I approached his vehicle, he drove away without hurrying, like someone ending a shift and going home for dinner. That night, Sarah and I packed everything we could fit in our truck and drove to Anchorage. I called my supervisor from the road and took emergency family leave, claiming a death in the family that required immediate relocation. We never went back to Knack Neck, never retrieved the belongings we couldn't carry, never found out what happened to the Toyota we'd been trying to sell. 6 months later, I heard through Fish and Wildlife channels that someone had been breaking into empty houses around Knack Neck, stealing personal items but never taking anything valuable. Photos, clothing, small mementos that held sentimental rather than monetary value. The break-ins always happened when residents were traveling, as if the perpetrator was monitoring people's schedules and waiting for optimal opportunities. I never reported our harassment to authorities because what could I prove? A man had called about buying our car, left some notes, and sat on our deck without permission. In the context of rural Alaska, where people often handle disputes informally and law enforcement is stretched thin, it probably would have seemed like a minor nuisance rather than the systematic stalking campaign it actually was. But I know what that man was really doing during those weeks of phone calls and surveillance. He was learning our patterns, studying our vulnerabilities, and preparing for something much worse than car shopping. The isolation that had drawn us to Alaska became the weapon he planned to use against us. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we stayed, if I hadn't been paranoid enough to flee after finding him watching our house. Whether he would have escalated to breaking in while we slept, or waited until Sarah was alone again and more completely helpless. Rural Alaska attracts people who want to disappear from their past, but it also provides perfect hunting grounds for predators who understand that help is always hours away and neighbors might not hear you scream. That soft-spoken man with his careful handwriting and methodical patience had found the perfect environment for whatever plans he was developing. I still check Craigslist sometimes, looking for car sale listings in small Alaska towns. Wondering if that same voice is making phone calls, asking invasive questions, and leaving notes under windshield wipers for new victims who don't yet understand how vulnerable they really are. The distance that makes Alaska beautiful also makes it deadly when someone decides you're worth hunting. Story 7. Vanishing hitchhiker of the Dalton Highway. The jacket was still warm when I found it folded on my passenger seat, but the woman who had been wearing it was gone. Completely gone. At 70 miles per hour on the most isolated highway in North America. My name is Marcus Webb, and I drive freight up the Dalton Highway for a living. 414 miles of pure Alaskan wilderness, connecting Fairbanks to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay. Most people call it the loneliest road in America. After what happened 3 nights ago, I know they are right. I had been driving for 6 hours straight when I saw her standing beside the road near milepost 180. The temperature outside was minus 23 degrees. She wore nothing but a thin cotton dress and campus shoes. No coat, no hat. Her dark hair whipped around her face in the Arctic wind, and she held out her thumb like she expected someone to actually stop. Every instinct told me to keep driving. You do not pick up strangers on the Dalton Highway. The road stretches through 300 miles of absolute nothing. No gas stations, no towns, no cell phone service, just frozen wilderness and the occasional trucker hauling supplies to the north slope. But something about the way she stood there, perfectly still despite the brutal wind, made me hit the brakes. I instantly knew history to stop beside her. Up close, she looked maybe 25 years old, pretty, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed too large for her face. She climbed into the cab without saying a word, moving with careful, deliberate movements like someone who was very cold. Jesus, what are you doing out here? I asked, cranking up the heat. You are going to freeze to death. She looked at me with those strange, dark eyes and smiled. Her lips were blue. Going to Dead Horse, she said quietly. Thank you for stopping. I shrugged off my heavy winter jacket and handed it to her. The thing probably weighed 10 pounds and was rated for 50 below zero. She took it gratefully and pulled it tight around her shoulders. Better? I asked. She nodded and settled back against the seat. Much better. I put the truck back in gear and pulled onto the highway. The CB radio crackled with static, but no voices. We were beyond the range of civilization now, heading deeper into the Arctic wasteland. Outside the windows, endless white stretched in every direction under a sky the color of old pewter. So what brings you way out here? I asked, trying to make conversation. Dead Horse is not exactly a tourist destination. Work, she said simply. My boyfriend is up there. Or was. I am trying to find him. What kind of work? She was quiet for a long moment. Pipeline work. He was supposed to come home last month, but he never did. His company says he just walked off the job one day, left all his things behind. I had heard stories like this before. The isolation of the North Slope did strange things to men. Some just snapped under the pressure and wandered off into the wilderness. Others drank themselves to death in their company trailers. A few simply vanished without explanation, swallowed by the endless white. What is his name? I asked. I know a lot of the guys up there. David Chen. He has been working the pipeline for 3 years. The name meant nothing to me, but I nodded anyway. I am sure we will find him. She smiled again, but it did not reach her eyes. I hope so. We drove in comfortable silence after that. The heater hummed steadily, fighting off the Arctic cold that pressed against the windows. Outside, the landscape remained unchanged. White hills rolling away to the horizon, scattered stands of stunted spruce trees, the occasional caribou trail cutting across the snow. Around milepost 200, I started feeling drowsy. The endless white was hypnotic, and I had been driving for 8 hours straight. I reached for my thermos of coffee and took a long drink. The caffeine helped, but my eyelids still felt heavy. You can pull over if you need to rest, she said suddenly. No, I am okay. Just tired. Another hour and we will hit the Yukon River crossing. I can rest there. She nodded and pulled my jacket tighter around herself. In the dim light of the cab, her face looked even paler than before. Almost translucent. I chalked it up to the cold and kept driving. The temperature outside had dropped to minus 30, even with the heater running full blast. Frost was forming on the inside of the windows. I could feel the cold seeping through the metal frame of the truck, turning the cab into a refrigerator. My passenger seemed unaffected. She sat perfectly still, staring out at the frozen landscape with those dark, unblinking eyes. Around milepost 220, things started getting strange. The first sign was the CB radio. It should have been silent this far from civilization, but instead it crackled with faint voices. Men talking in urgent, frightened tones about something they had seen on the road. Their words were too distorted to make out clearly, but I caught fragments. She was just standing there, impossible in this cold. Where did she go? I turned up the volume, but the voices faded into static. Did you hear that? I asked my passenger. She did not respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the landscape outside, and for a moment I wondered if she had fallen asleep. But her breathing was too shallow, too quiet. It was like she was barely breathing at all. The second sign was the cold. Despite the heater running at maximum, the temperature in the cab was dropping. My breath began to fog, and ice crystals formed on the dashboard. I could feel the cold radiating from my passenger like she was made of ice herself. Are you okay? I asked. You feel really cold. She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood freeze. Not fear or sadness or hope. Nothing. Her eyes were completely empty, like looking into deep water at night. I am fine, she said, but her voice sounded different now. Distant, like an echo from the bottom of a well. The third sign was the road itself. I had driven the Dalton Highway hundreds of times, but suddenly nothing looked familiar. The landmarks I knew by heart were gone. The hills had the wrong shape. The trees grew in patterns I had never seen before. It was like we had driven into a completely different world. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only static. The odometer read milepost 230, but that was impossible. We should have reached the Yukon River crossing by now. Instead, the road stretched ahead into darkness, disappearing into a wall of blowing snow. Where are we? I asked, more to myself than to her. Almost there, she said quietly. I wanted to ask where there was, but something in her voice stopped me. The temperature in the cab had dropped even further. Ice was forming on the steering wheel under my hands. My breath came out in thick white clouds, and I could feel the cold burning my lungs. Then I saw them. Lights in the distance, floating just above the road. Not headlights or streetlights, but something else entirely. They pulsed with a pale, sickly glow that hurt to look at directly. As we got closer, I realized they were not lights at all. They were people, dozens of them, standing along the roadside in the blowing snow. Men and women in work clothes and winter gear, their faces pale as bone in the truck, as headlights. They did not wave or move or acknowledge us in any way. They just stood there, perfectly still, watching us pass with empty, hollow eyes. Who are they? I whispered. The ones who never made it home, my passenger said. I wanted to stop the truck. I wanted to turn around and drive back the way we had come. But my hands would not obey my brain. They kept the wheel steady, kept us moving forward into the darkness ahead. The fuel gauge read empty, but the engine kept running. The speedometer showed 0, but we kept moving. More people appeared along the roadside. Hundreds of them now, standing in silent rows like an army of the dead. I recognized some of their faces from missing person reports I had seen over the years. Pipeline workers who had vanished without a trace. Truck drivers who had never completed their runs. Travelers who had simply disappeared into the Arctic wilderness. This is not real, I said out loud. This cannot be real. My passenger turned to look at me one last time. Her face was no longer pale. It was white as snow, white as bone, white as death itself. When she smiled, I could see that her teeth were made of ice. My name is Sarah Chen, she said. I have been waiting for someone to give me a ride home. The name hit me like a physical blow. Sarah Chen. I remember the story now. She had disappeared on the Dalton Highway 23 years ago. Her car was found abandoned at milepost 180, but her body was never recovered. The official report said she had probably wandered into the wilderness and died of exposure. But the truckers who worked the highway told a different story. They said she was still out there, still trying to get home to a life that no longer existed. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The cold had frozen my vocal cords solid. David never worked on the pipeline, she continued. David was my brother. He died in a car accident the day before I disappeared. I was driving north to identify his body when my car broke down. I waited for hours for someone to stop, but the cold took me before help arrived. The truck was completely filled with Arctic air now. Ice covered every surface, and my breath came in short, painful gasps. But I could not stop driving. The engine hummed steadily, pulling us deeper into the frozen darkness. I've been riding with drivers like you for 23 years, she said. Looking for a way home. But there is no home anymore. There is only the road and the cold and the endless waiting. She reached over and touched my arm. Her fingers burned like dry ice against my skin. Thank you for the jacket. And thank you for listening to my story. Then she was gone. Not gradually, not slowly fading away. Just gone, like she had never been there at all. The only proof of her existence was my winter jacket, folded neatly on the passenger seat. When I touched it, the fabric was so cold it burned my fingers. The truck lurched to a stop. The engine died with a final shudder, and silence filled the cab. Outside, the landscape had returned to normal, rolling white hills under a gray sky. No people standing by the roadside. No mysterious lights in the distance. Just the empty, frozen wilderness of the Dalton Highway. I checked my GPS. Milepost 181. Somehow, we had only traveled 1 mile from where I picked her up. But the fuel gauge read empty, and the engine would not restart. I sat there in the growing cold, staring at the folded jacket on the seat beside me. It took 6 hours for another trucker to find me. By then, I was nearly frozen solid myself. He jumped my battery and followed me to the nearest fuel station, asking questions I could not answer. How had I run out of fuel after filling up just hours before? Why was there ice covering me inside of my cab when the heater was working perfectly? I never told him about Sarah Chen. I never told anyone about that night on the Dalton Highway. But sometimes, when I am driving that stretch of road near milepost 180, I slow down and look for her. Part of me hopes I will never see her again, but part of me knows I will, because Sarah Chen is still out there, still waiting for someone to stop, still trying to find her way home to a life that ended 23 years ago. And sooner or later, every driver on the Dalton Highway meets her. The jacket is still in my truck. I keep it folded on the passenger seat, just in case, because I know she will need it when she climbs in again. The cold up there is killer, and some people never really escape it. Story 8. Thing in the glacier, the eyes were still watching me through 10,000 years of ice, and I knew they had been waiting for someone like me to find them. My name is Jake Morrison, and I run glacier tours in Juneau, Alaska. 23 years guiding tourists through ice caves, and I thought I had seen everything the Mendenhall Glacier could show me. I was wrong, dead wrong. 3 weeks ago, an unusual warm spell opened up a new tunnel system deep in the glacier. The kind of formation that happens maybe once in a decade. Pure blue ice stretching back into the mountain, carved by ancient meltwater that had been frozen solid since before civilization began. I went in alone on a Tuesday morning to check if it was safe for tourists. Standard procedure: headlamp, backup lights, rope, emergency beacon. The tunnel entrance was about 6 feet high and perfectly round, like nature had used a giant drill bit to bore into the ice. My boots crunched on loose ice crystals as I made my way deeper into the glacier. The walls were incredible, layers of compressed snow and ice laid down over thousands of years, each one telling the story of a different winter. Some layers were crystal clear, others were cloudy white or pale blue. In some sections, I could see debris trapped in the ice. Leaves, branches, even the occasional insect preserved like specimens in a museum. About 50 yards in, I found the first anomaly. It was embedded in the left wall, maybe 8 feet off the ground. At first glance, it looked like a large piece of driftwood. But as I aimed my headlamp directly at it, I realized it was bone. A massive femur, longer than my arm and thick as a baseball bat. The bone was dark brown, almost black, and covered in a thin film of ice. I had seen mammoth bones before in other glaciers. Alaska is full of them. But this bone looked different. Wrong somehow. The proportions were off. Too long, too thick, shaped like no animal I had ever studied. I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures, though the flash barely penetrated the thick ice surrounding the specimen. 40 yards deeper, I found more bones. Ribs this time, arranged in a perfect curve like they were still attached to a living creature. The ice around them was darker than the rest of the tunnel, filled with what looked like frozen organic matter. Plant debris maybe, or decomposed flesh that had been locked in ice for millennia. My breath came out in white clouds that froze instantly in the sub-zero air. The tunnel was getting narrower, forcing me to duck my head as I moved forward. The walls pressed closer together, and the ceiling dropped to maybe 5 feet. But something kept pulling me deeper into the glacier. That something was the smell. Even through the frozen air, I could detect it. Faint but unmistakable. The smell of decay. Of meat that had been rotting for so long it had become something else entirely. Something that should not exist in a sterile ice environment where nothing could decompose. At the 60-yard mark, My headlamp beam caught something that made me stop breathing. It was a skull, human-sized but wrong in every other way. The eye sockets were too large, the jaw too long, the cranium stretched backward like someone had grabbed it and pulled. It hung suspended in the ice wall at eye level, tilted at an angle that made it look like it was trying to turn toward me. I stepped closer and aimed my backup light at it. The bone was the same dark brown as the others, but there were markings carved into the surface. Symbols that looked almost like writing but belonged to no language I had ever seen. The markings covered the entire skull in intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. My hands were shaking as I took more pictures. This was not a tourist attraction. This was a discovery that would change everything we knew about prehistoric Alaska. I needed to get back to town and contact the university. Bring in a proper archaeological team. But first, I had to see how far the tunnel went. The passage continued for another 30 yards before opening into a natural chamber about the size of a small bedroom. The ceiling arched up to maybe 8 feet, and the walls curved inward like the inside of an egg. My lights illuminated the entire space, revealing something that made my blood turn to ice water. The chamber was full of them, dozens of the creatures, suspended in the walls like insects in amber. But these were not just bones. These were complete specimens, preserved so perfectly I could see every detail of their impossible anatomy. They were roughly human in shape but wrong in every proportion. 7 feet tall with elongated limbs and fingers that ended in claws. Their skin was pale gray and looked like leather that had been stretched too thin. And their faces, God help me, their faces. The features were almost human but distorted like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Eyes too large and set too far apart. Mouths that stretched wider than any human mouth should. And expressions of such pure malevolence that looking at them made my skin crawl. But the worst part was not their appearance. The worst part was that some of them looked recent. Not all the specimens were the same dark brown as the ancient bones. Some were lighter in color, their flesh still pink and pliable looking, like they had been frozen yesterday instead of 10,000 years ago. Which was impossible. Nothing could survive being frozen in a glacier. Nothing could remain that well preserved without being ancient. I moved closer to examine one of the fresher specimens, and that was when I saw the clothing. Modern hiking boots, a torn Gore-Tex jacket, a digital watch still strapped to its wrist. The thing had been wearing 21st century gear when it was frozen into the glacier wall. But how could that be possible? My headlamp flickered. The batteries were getting cold, losing power in the sub-zero environment. I smacked the light with my palm, and the beam steadied. But in the brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn I saw something move in my peripheral vision. I spun around, sweeping my light across the chamber. Everything looked the same. The creatures hung motionless in their icy tombs, trapped for eternity in the frozen walls. But something felt different, like the air pressure had changed or the temperature had dropped even lower. That was when I noticed the breathing. Not my breathing, something else. A slow, rhythmic sound like air being drawn through water. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the ice walls and ceiling. I held my breath and listened. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. My backup light flickered and went out completely. Now I had only my headlamp, and its beam was getting weaker by the minute. I needed to get out of the chamber before I was trapped in complete darkness 60 yards inside a glacier. But as I turned to leave, my light swept across something that froze me solid with terror. One of the specimens was looking at me. Not all of them, just one, embedded in the far wall about 5 feet off the ground. Its head was turned in my direction, and its massive pale eyes were wide open and focused directly on my face. The expression of malevolence I had seen before was gone. Now it looked curious, hungry, like it was studying me the same way I had been studying it. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the ice floor. My headlamp beam shook wildly as I tried to keep the thing in sight. But it had not moved. Its body remained frozen in the same position, arms spread wide, mouth hanging open. Only the eyes had changed. Only the direction of its gaze. The breathing sound was getting louder, more urgent, like whatever was making it was waking up from a very long sleep. I ran. My boots pounded against the ice as I sprinted through the narrow tunnel toward the entrance. Behind me, I could hear sounds that had no business existing in a glacier. Cracking ice, shifting weight, something large pulling itself free from a prison that had held it for millennia. My headlamp died completely when I was still 20 yards from the exit. I kept running in absolute darkness, one hand on the wall to guide me, the other stretched out in front to keep from hitting my head on the low ceiling. The sounds behind me were getting closer. Not footsteps exactly, but something dragging itself across the ice with wet, sliding movements. I burst out of the tunnel into blinding daylight and kept running until I reached my truck. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When the engine finally started, I gunned it down the mountain road toward town without looking back. That was 3 weeks ago. I called the Forest Service that same day and told them about an unstable ice formation that needed to be sealed for public safety. They closed the tunnel entrance with explosive charges 2 days later. Officially, it was a controlled collapse to prevent tourist injuries. Unofficially, I made sure that whatever was in that chamber stayed buried under 100 tons of ice and rock. But I know it is still there, still watching, still waiting for someone else to find it. Because the thing about glaciers is that they never stop moving. Ice flows downhill like slow-motion water, carrying everything inside it toward the sea. And every year, the Mendenhall Glacier moves a little farther down the valley. Every year, new tunnels open up and old ones are exposed. The Forest Service thinks they sealed one tunnel, but glaciers are living things with minds of their own. What nature buried once, nature will reveal again. And when it does, that thing will be waiting. Those pale eyes will be watching. And next time, it might not be alone. I do not guide glacier tours anymore. I moved to Phoenix last month and got a job selling insurance. Nice, boring, predictable work in a place where the only ice comes in cubes. But sometimes at night, when the desert wind rattles my windows, I hear that breathing sound again. Slow and rhythmic and patient. Because I know the truth now. The thing in the glacier was not trapped. It was sleeping, and I woke it up. Sleep tight. Story 9. Radio transmission from the depths. The voice that came through my radio at 3:17 in the morning was calling for help from the bottom of the ocean, and it knew my name. My name is Captain Tom Bradley, and I have been fishing the waters of Bristol Bay for 31 years. I have seen storms that could crack a mountain and waves tall enough to swallow buildings. But nothing in 3 decades of commercial fishing prepared me for what happened during the storm of October 15, 2023. The weather report that morning called for moderate seas and light winds. The kind of forecast that gets crab boats racing to their favorite spots before conditions change. My crew and I were hauling pots about 40 miles southwest of Dillingham when the sky turned black without warning. One minute we were working under overcast but calm conditions. The next minute, 30-foot waves were slamming into the hull of my boat like the fist of God. The Sarah Marie is a 120-foot crab processor built to handle the worst conditions Alaska can throw at her. But this storm was different. The wind hit us from 3 directions at once, creating a chaotic sea state that defied everything I knew about weather patterns. Waves crashed over the deck with such force that they bent steel railings and shattered reinforced windows. My crew of 8 men huddled in the wheelhouse as I fought to keep us pointed into the waves. The engine screamed at full power just to maintain position against the hurricane-force winds. Lightning struck the water around us in brilliant white sheets, illuminating mountainous swells that stretched to the horizon in every direction. That was when the radio started acting up. At first, it was just static, the normal interference you get during electrical storms. But around 3 in the morning, when the storm was at its worst, I began picking up fragments of transmissions on frequencies that should have been empty. Voices calling out coordinates that made no sense. Emergency broadcasts from vessels that did not show up on our radar or GPS. Most of it was too distorted to understand. Bursts of static punctuated by single words or numbers that faded in and out like signals from another dimension. But one transmission came through crystal clear, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the waters of Bristol Bay. The voice was male, middle-aged, with the distinctive accent of someone who had spent his life on fishing boats. He was calling a mayday on Channel 16, the international distress frequency. But he was broadcasting on a frequency that had not been used by commercial vessels since the 1970s. The transmission lasted exactly 43 seconds. I know because I timed it on my watch, thinking it might be important for the Coast Guard report I would file later. What I heard in those 43 seconds still wakes me up at night. The voice identified himself as Captain Robert Henley of the fishing vessel Northern Light. He gave his position as latitude 58 degrees, 42 minutes north, longitude 157 degrees, 18 minutes west. I grabbed my chart and plotted the coordinates while he spoke. The position he gave was directly beneath my boat, but 300 feet underwater. Captain Henley reported that his vessel was taking on water through multiple hull breaches. His engines were dead. His pumps were failing, and his crew was trapped in the forward compartments. He requested immediate assistance from any vessel in the area. But the strange part was not what he said. The strange part was how he said it. His voice was calm, professional, like a man reporting routine equipment problems instead of a catastrophic emergency. There was no panic, no urgency, no emotion at all. He could have been reading a grocery list instead of calling for help while his boat sank beneath him. Then he said something that made my blood turn cold. He said he could see lights moving in the water around his vessel. Large, phosphorescent shapes that circled the northern light like predators stalking prey. He described them as being longer than his boat and moving with purpose and intelligence. They were coming closer, he said, and they seemed to be trying to communicate with tapping sounds against the hull. The transmission continued for another 20 seconds. Captain Henley reported that the tapping had stopped and that something was pulling at his rudder. His voice remained eerily calm as he described metal being twisted and torn like paper. Then he said 5 words that I will never forget. He said the things were inside his boat. That was when the screaming started. Not just one voice, but multiple voices shrieking in terror and agony. Men calling out names and pleading for mercy from something that apparently showed none. The sound was so raw and primal that it made my crew physically recoil from the radio speaker. One of my deckhands actually vomited. The screaming lasted for maybe 10 seconds before it was cut off by a sound like nothing I have ever heard. Imagine the noise a tin can makes when you crush it, but amplified 1,000 times. Metal grinding against metal with such force that it created a harmonic frequency that hurt to listen to. Then silence. I tried to raise Captain Henley on the radio, but got no response. I switched to the emergency frequency and called the Coast Guard, reporting a vessel in distress at the coordinates he had given. The duty officer took down my information and promised to dispatch a helicopter as soon as the storm passed. But when I gave him the name of the vessel, Northern Light, his tone changed completely. He asked me to repeat the name and the coordinates. When I did, there was a long pause before he came back on the radio. He told me to stay on my present heading and to report any other unusual transmissions immediately. Then he signed off without explanation. The storm began to break around dawn. The waves subsided to manageable levels, and the wind dropped to a steady 20 knots from the southwest. Normal October weather for Bristol Bay. As soon as conditions allowed, I had my crew deploy our fish finder to scan the ocean floor directly beneath us. What we found should not have been possible. The depth sounder showed a large metallic object resting on the bottom at exactly the coordinates Captain Henley had given. The object was approximately 130 feet long and appeared to be the remains of a commercial fishing vessel. But according to our GPS, we were in 320 feet of water. No fishing boat should have been able to reach that depth and maintain structural integrity. More disturbing was the age of the wreck. Our sonar equipment included bottom composition analysis that could estimate how long an object had been submerged based on sediment accumulation and metal corrosion patterns. The computer analysis suggested the wreck had been on the ocean floor for approximately 50 years. I called the Coast Guard again and reported our sonar findings. This time, a different officer responded. He seemed to know exactly what I was talking about and asked very specific questions about the transmission I had received. Questions about the voice, the exact wording of the distress call, and the sounds that followed. When I finished my report, he told me something that made my hands shake. The Northern Light was a crab fishing boat that disappeared in Bristol Bay on October 15, 1973. Exactly 50 years ago to the day. The vessel was captained by Robert Henley and carried a crew of 7 men. They were working the same fishing grounds where I had received the transmission when a sudden storm struck the area. The Northern Light sent a routine position report at 11:30 that night, then vanished without a trace. No distress call was ever received. No debris was ever found. The Coast Guard searched for 2 weeks but never located the wreck. The disappearance was classified as lost with all hands, cause unknown. But according to the officer, I was not the first person to receive a transmission from Captain Henley. Every year on October 15th, during severe weather conditions in Bristol Bay, at least one fishing boat picks up the same distress call on the same obsolete frequency. Always the same voice, always the same coordinates, always ending with the same terrifying sounds of men screaming and metal being destroyed. The Coast Guard has been documenting these transmissions for decades but has never been able to explain them. Radio experts have analyzed the signal characteristics and confirmed that they match the equipment used on commercial fishing vessels in the early 1970s. The voice prints have been compared to recordings of Captain Robert Henley and are a perfect match. But the most disturbing discovery came when the Coast Guard finally located the wreck of the Northern Light in 1998. A deep-sea survey vessel found the remains in exactly the position given in the radio transmissions. resting upright on the ocean floor as if it had settled there gently instead of crashing through 300 feet of water. The hull showed extensive damage consistent with the sounds heard during the transmissions. But the damage pattern made no sense. The metal had been twisted and torn from the inside out, not crushed by water pressure or torn apart by collision with the seabed. Something inside the boat had ripped through the hull with tremendous force, creating openings large enough for a man to walk through. The most chilling discovery was in the wheelhouse. The radio equipment was still intact and appeared to be in working condition despite 5 decades underwater. The microphone was found positioned as if someone had been speaking into it at the moment the boat sank. But the wheelhouse was empty, as was the rest of the boat. No bodies were ever recovered from the Northern Light, despite the fact that the vessel sank in weather conditions that would have made escape impossible. The official Coast Guard report classified the incident as an unexplained maritime disaster and sealed the file. But word spreads fast in the small fishing communities of Alaska. Everyone who works these waters knows about the Northern Light and her crew. And everyone knows to expect that transmission when the weather turns bad on October 15th. What nobody talks about is what happened to the bodies. I started doing research after that night, digging through old newspaper archives and maritime records. What I found painted a disturbing pattern going back more than a century. Ships and boats of every size have been disappearing in Bristol Bay since the 1800s. Always during severe weather, always without distress calls, always leaving behind no debris or survivors. The native Yupik people who have lived in this region for thousands of years have stories about things that hunt in the deep waters during storms. They call them the Hungry Ones, and they say these creatures have been pulling vessels down into the depths since before the first white men arrived in Alaska. According to the legends, the Hungry Ones are drawn to the surface by the electrical energy of lightning strikes and the vibrations of engines fighting heavy seas. They surround vessels from below and use their massive bodies to drag them down into the crushing depths. But they do not kill the crews immediately. The stories say the creatures keep their victims alive in air pockets within their underwater layers, feeding on human fear and desperation for as long as possible. The victims remain conscious and aware, trapped in a nightmare that can last for decades. And sometimes, when conditions are right, their voices can still reach the surface world through radio waves that carry across the boundary between life and death. I do not know if the legends are true. I do not know what really happened to Captain Robert Henley and his crew. But I know what I heard that night, and I know that it was not my imagination or equipment malfunction. 3 weeks after the storm, I received a package at my home address with no return label. Inside was a waterlogged logbook from the Northern Light, dated October 15, 1973. The final entry was written in Captain Henley's handwriting and consisted of a single line. It said they were still down there, still calling for help, still waiting for someone to answer. I sold the Sarah Marie 2 days later and moved to Montana. I bought a small ranch in the mountains where the only water is a creek that runs behind my house. I raise cattle now, which is about as far from commercial fishing as a man can get. But sometimes, when thunderstorms roll through the valley, I hear voices on my ham radio. Faint transmissions from places that should not exist, carried on frequencies that should be empty. And sometimes, late at night when the static is particularly bad, I hear Captain Robert Henley calling out coordinates from the bottom of Bristol Bay. He is still down there. They all are, and every October 15th, when the storms rage across those dark waters, they try to warn other fishermen about what lurks in the depths. But nobody listens to voices from the dead, and the Hungry Ones are always waiting for the next vessel to venture too far from shore on a night when the lightning strikes the water and the waves grow tall enough to hide monsters. If you ever find yourself fishing the waters of Bristol Bay during a storm, and your radio picks up a distress call from the Northern Light, do not answer. Do not acknowledge the transmission. Turn off your radio and head for the nearest port as fast as your engines can carry you. Because Captain Robert Henley and his crew learned the hard way that some things in the ocean are older and hungrier than anything man was meant to encounter. And once the Hungry Ones know you are there, they will never stop trying to drag you down to join the collection of voices calling out from the depths. The water remembers everything. And in Bristol Bay, the dead never really die. They just keep fishing in waters too deep for sunlight to reach, forever. Story 10. Whispering Trail. The trees were talking to me, and I should have listened. My name is Jake Morrison, and I came to Sitka 3 months ago to forget. Divorce, lost job, the usual midlife collapse that drives men to remote corners of Alaska. I figured the silence of the rainforest would help clear my head. I was wrong about the silence. It started on my second week hiking the trails around Sitka. The forest there is unlike anywhere else in America. Ancient Sitka spruces tower 300 feet overhead, their branches so thick they block out most daylight. The undergrowth is a maze of devil, club, and fallen logs, everything covered in a carpet of moss so deep your boots sink with each step. The first time I heard the whispering, I thought it was wind through the branches. But there was no wind that day. The air hung still and heavy, thick with the smell of rotting cedar and salt from the nearby ocean. The sound came from everywhere at once, a low murmur like voices in another room, just quiet enough that you can to make out the words. I stopped on the trail and listened. The whispering continued, rising and falling like distant conversation. I called out, thinking maybe other hikers were nearby, but my voice died in the thick air. The forest swallowed sound, as if the trees themselves were absorbing everything. That should have been my first warning. I kept hiking deeper into the woods, following a trail that seemed well maintained despite being miles from the visitor center. The path wound between massive tree trunks, some so wide it would take 6 men holding hands to circle them. The canopy above created a green twilight that never changed, making it impossible to tell time. The whispering grew stronger as I walked. Sometimes it sounded like my ex-wife Sarah, calling my name from behind the trees. Other times it was my old boss, discussing the layoffs that had cost me my job. But when I turned toward the voices, there was only moss and shadow. After an hour, I realized I was lost. The trail had split and merged so many times I couldn't remember which way I had come from. My GPS showed nothing but green forest in every direction. No trails, no landmarks, nothing but thousands of acres of wilderness. That is when the paranoia started. Every rustling leaf became something stalking me. Every creaking branch was a footstep. The whispering voices seemed to move through the trees, always just ahead of me, drawing me deeper into the forest. I found myself following the sound without meaning to, my feet carrying me off the trail and into the thick undergrowth. The deeper I went, the older the forest became. These trees predated European settlement, some maybe 1,000 years old. Their bark was scarred with symbols I didn't recognize, carved deep into the wood and blackened with age. The marks looked deliberate, purposeful, like warnings in a language I couldn't read. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but the screen flickered and died despite showing full battery that morning. My compass spun wildly, the needle never settling on a direction. Even my watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 2:17. The whispering was louder now, close enough that I should have been able to understand the words. But the voices spoke in a language that hurt to hear, syllables that seemed to twist in my ears. The sound made my teeth ache and filled my head with images that weren't my own. I saw native hunters moving through these same trees centuries ago. I saw Russian fur traders meeting with Tlingit chiefs in clearings that no longer existed. I saw things that had never been human. Creatures made of shadow and moss that watched from between the massive trunks. The visions felt more real than my own memories. I stumbled into a clearing where the canopy opened enough to let in actual sunlight. In the center stood a ring of 7 Sitka spruces, each one perfectly positioned around a raised mound of earth. The trees were ancient even by forest standards, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching toward each other like gnarled fingers. The whispering stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the voices had been. It pressed against my eardrums like deep water, making me dizzy and nauseous. I approached the center mound, and that is when I saw them. Bones, hundreds of them, arranged in careful patterns around the base of each tree. Not animal bones, these were human remains, sorted by type. Skulls in one pile, femurs in another, ribs stacked like cordwood. Some looked recent, still showing traces of flesh and clothing. Others were so old they turned black and crumbled at the edges. I backed away, but my foot caught on something buried in the moss. I looked down and saw more bones. These ones still connected, still wearing the remains of hiking boots and a fleece jacket. A Park Service badge hung from the ribcage, the name partially visible, Archen, Ranger. The whispering returned, but now I could understand every word. The voices belonged to everyone who entered this clearing. They spoke of being led here, drawn by sounds that promised help or companionship. They spoke of trying to leave but finding every path led back to the same spot. They spoke of hunger and thirst and the growing certainty that they would never see home again. And they spoke of the watchers. I felt them before I saw them. Presences moving between the 7 trees, circling the clearing with patient intelligence. They weren't quite solid, more like distortions in the air, but they cast shadows on the moss-covered ground. As they moved, the carved symbols on the tree bark began to glow with a faint green light. The voices explained everything. This was sacred ground, a place where the Tlingit had once made offerings to forest spirits they called kudit. The early Russian settlers had violated the site, cutting down one of the original guardian trees to build a chapel. The spirits had responded by claiming the clearing as their own, trapping anyone who entered without permission. For 200 years, they'd been collecting trespassers, hikers, hunters, researchers, park rangers, anyone who wandered too far from the marked trails and heard the whispering call. The bones were offerings, sacrifices to appease spirits who could never be fully satisfied. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The air around me grew thick as honey, holding me in place while the watchers closed in. They moved like smoke given form, reaching out with fingers made of shadow and regret. That's when I understood the final horror. I wasn't their prisoner. I was their newest recruiter. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Every person who died here became part of the trap. Their voice added to the whispering chorus that lured others into the clearing. I could already feel my own thoughts mixing with theirs, my memories becoming part of the collective lure. But I had one advantage the others hadn't. I was still alive, still had a choice. I bit down on my tongue hard enough to taste blood, using the pain to focus my will. Instead of trying to run, I dropped to my knees and pressed my palms against the moss-covered ground. I spoke to the spirits in the only way I could, offering respect instead of resistance. I acknowledged their claim to this place, their right to protect what was sacred. I admitted my trespass and asked for the wisdom to leave without causing further offense. I promised to warn others away, to become a guardian instead of a victim. The watchers paused, considering. The green light from the tree symbols pulsed brighter, and I felt something vast and ancient studying my intentions. The whispers rose to a crescendo, hundreds of voices debating my fate in languages that predated human speech. Finally, they reached a decision. The thick air released me, but the relief was temporary. The spirits had accepted my offer, but their terms were harsh. I could leave, but I would carry part of them with me. I would hear their whispers wherever I went, feel their presence in every forest I entered. And someday, when I served my purpose as a warning, they would call me back to join the bones beneath the 7 trees. I found my way out of the forest 3 days later, though I have no memory of the journey. Park rangers found me on the highway outside Sitka, dehydrated and babbling about voices in the trees. They said I'd been missing for a week, though it felt like hours to me. The official report blamed dehydration and exposure for my hallucinations. They closed several trails pending a safety review, which was exactly what the spirits wanted. Fewer people would wander into their domain now. Fewer voices would join their eternal chorus. But I know the truth. The whispering never stopped. Even now, 3 months later, I hear them in every forest, every park, every place where trees grow thick enough to hide shadows. They recalling to others, using my voice now as part of their lure. Sometimes I catch myself speaking words I didn't choose, describing the beauty of remote trails to fellow hikers, suggesting they explore beyond the marked paths. The spirits kept their bargain. I warn people when I can, tell them to stay on designated trails and never follow mysterious voices in the woods. But I also serve their purpose, drawing the curious and the reckless toward places they shouldn't go. I'm writing this as both warning and confession. If you ever visit Sitka, stay on the marked trails. Don't trust voices that call from the forest, even if they sound like people you know. Don't follow whispers that promise something wonderful just beyond the next tree. The forest spirits are patient, and they always hungry for new voices to add to their collection. They'll use whatever they have to, including people like me who thought they could bargain with forces older than civilization. The trees are still talking to me as I write this. They retelling me it's time to come home, time to take my place among the bones beneath the 7 trees. My service as a warner is almost over, and my real purpose is about to begin. If you rereading this, it means I didn't fight the call. It means I am back in that clearing, adding my voice to the whispers that will lure the next lost soul into the whispering woods of Sitka. Listen carefully when you hike. The voices you hear might be mine. Story 11. Frozen man, I saw him standing in my headlights. and I should have kept driving. My name is Tom Brennan, and they've been driving long-haul trucks across Alaska for 8 years. I've seen everything the last frontier can throw at you. Whiteout blizzards that last for days, roads that disappear under 10 feet of snow, temperatures that crack steel and shatter dreams. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered on the Cougarock Road outside Nome last February. I was running a supply load to the gold dredges up north, one of those middle-of-winter runs that pays triple because nobody else wants to risk it. The weather report called for light snow, but weather reports in Alaska are more like suggestions than facts. By the time I hit the outskirts of Nome, the wind was howling at 60 miles per hour and the snow was coming down so thick I could barely see my own hood. That is when I saw him. He stood about 50 yards ahead, right in the middle of the road. At first glance, he looked like any other winter traveler caught in a storm. Heavy coat, boots, the kind of gear you need to survive Alaska winters. But something was wrong with the way he stood. Too still, too perfect, like a statue placed in. I slowed the truck and hit the high beams. That is when I saw the truth. The man wasn't wearing winter gear. He was encased in ice. Thick, cloudy ice covered him from head to toe, like he'd been dipped in frozen water and left to crystallize. The ice was so thick I could barely make out the shape of a human form underneath, but I could see enough to know this wasn't some elaborate sculpture or practical joke. I stopped the truck about 20 feet away and grabbed my emergency flashlight. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged my presence in any way. Through the swirling snow, I could see that the ice covering him was different from anything I had seen before. It wasn't smooth like normal ice, but textured, almost organic looking, like it had grown around him rather than formed on him. I stepped out of the cab, and the wind hit me like a physical blow. The temperature was at least 30 below, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. But the frozen man showed no reaction to the storm raging around him. He just stood there, perfectly motionless, as if the blizzard was happening in a different world. I approached slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through the snow. As I got closer, I could see more details that made my skin crawl. The ice wasn't uniform. It was thicker in some places, thinner in others, and underneath I could make out the shape of a face pressed against the frozen shell. The face was twisted in an expression of absolute terror. I could see his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with panic. But most disturbing was the way his hands were positioned. They were pressed against the inner surface of the ice, fingers spread wide as if he'd been trying to claw his way out when the freezing process had stopped him forever. I called out, asking if he was okay, if he needed help, but there was no response. The figure remained perfectly still, a frozen monument to some unimaginable horror. I walked around him in a complete circle, and from every angle the story was the same. A man trapped inside a shell of ice, forever frozen in his moment of greatest fear. That is when I noticed the tracks. Leading away from the frozen figure were footprints in the snow, not boot prints. These were different. They were perfectly round, about the size of a dinner plate, and they seemed to be made by something walking without lifting its feet. The tracks created long, smooth furrows in the snow, as if something had been sliding rather than walking. The tracks led back toward town. I followed them with my flashlight, and after about 100 yards, I found another frozen figure. This one was a woman, trapped in the same kind of ice shell, her face showing the same expression of absolute terror. Her hands were reaching upward, as if she'd been trying to escape from something pulling her down into the ground. The tracks continued past her, leading to a third figure, then a fourth. Each one was perfectly preserved in ice, each one captured in a moment of pure horror. Men, women, even a child, all trapped in their frozen shells like insects in amber. I counted 12 figures total, all following the same path back toward Nome. But the tracks didn't stop at the last frozen person. They kept going, disappearing into the swirling snow in the direction of the town lights. I should have gotten back in my truck and driven away. Should have reported what I'd found to the authorities and let them handle it. Instead, I followed the tracks. The trail led through a landscape that didn't match any map I knew. The terrain shifted and changed as I walked, valleys appearing where there should have been hills, ridges rising from what had been flat ground. It was as if the very land was reshaping itself around me, creating a path that existed only in this storm, only in this moment. The tracks brought me to the outskirts of Nome, but not the Nome I remembered. The buildings were wrong, older, made of materials that didn't belong in modern Alaska. The streets were laid out in patterns that hurt to look at, turning back on themselves in impossible ways. And everywhere, there were more frozen figures. They stood in doorways, sat on benches, leaned against buildings. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all encased in the same thick, cloudy ice, all wearing the same expression of terminal fear. The town had become a museum of the frozen dead, a gallery of people caught in their final moments of horror. I realized I was looking at Nome's missing persons, decades worth of people who vanished into the Alaskan wilderness and never been found. Gold prospectors from the early 1900s, recent hunters and hikers, even some faces I recognized from missing person posters in truck stops and diners. But they weren't just randomly placed. They were arranged in a pattern, positioned to form some kind of massive symbol when viewed from above. The frozen figures created lines and curves that stretched across the entire town, a design so large and complex it could only be seen from the air or understood by something with a perspective far beyond human comprehension. That is when I heard the sound. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but it was coming from beneath my feet. The ground vibrated with each pulse, and I could feel the rhythm in my bones. Something enormous was moving underground, something that made the earth itself shiver with each step. The sound grew closer, and the ice-covered figures began to turn. Not quickly, not with any visible movement, but when I looked away and then back, they were facing different directions. All of them were slowly rotating to face the same point, like compass needles drawn to magnetic north. And that point was me. I ran. The landscape shifted around me as I fled, streets stretching longer, buildings moving to block my path. But somehow I found my truck, still sitting where I left it on the road. I climbed in and gunned the engine, not caring about road conditions or visibility. I just needed to get away from that place, from those frozen watchers and whatever was moving beneath the ground. I drove straight through the night and didn't stop until I reached Anchorage. I tried to report what I'd seen, but the authorities treated it like a stress hallucination brought on by the extreme weather. When search teams went out to check the Cougar Rock Road, they found nothing. No frozen figures, no mysterious tracks, no signs that anything unusual had happened. But I know what I saw, and I know it's not over, because every winter since then, I've been getting reports from other drivers. Sightings of frozen figures standing in remote locations across Alaska, always during the worst storms, always in places where people have gone missing over the years. The figures are spreading, moving further from Nome, appearing on highways and trails throughout the state. And they're not random anymore. They reforming a larger pattern, one that spans the entire territory. Each new frozen figure is positioned to extend the design I saw that night in Nome, creating something massive and deliberate across hundreds of miles of wilderness. I've been tracking the sightings, mapping the locations, trying to understand what is being created. The pattern is almost complete now. Just a few more pieces needed to finish whatever vast symbol is being carved into the landscape with frozen human bodies. I think I know where the final figures need to be placed. The pattern points to specific locations, remote spots where the design can be completed. And I think that is why I'm getting the dreams now. Visions of myself standing in those exact spots, feeling the ice beginning to form around my body. The thing beneath Nome is calling to me, just like it called to all the others. It needs one more piece to complete its work. One more frozen sentinel to finish the message it has been spelling out across Alaska for over a century. I can feel myself being drawn north, pulled by something stronger than curiosity or logic. Every night, the dreams get more vivid, more insistent. I see myself walking into the storm, feeling the ice shell beginning to form, understanding finally what message all those frozen figures have been trying to convey. I'm writing this as my last act of free will, my final attempt to resist the call. But I can already feel my resistance weakening. The ice is already starting to form in my dreams, and soon it won't be just dreams anymore. If you were ever driving through Alaska in the winter and you see a figure standing in your headlights, don't stop. Don't try to help. Just keep driving and pray that you were not the final piece needed to complete a puzzle that has been decades in the making. The Iceman of Nome isn't just one person. It's all of us, everyone who has ever been called to take their place in the grand design. And when the pattern is finally complete, when the last frozen figure takes their position, something that has been sleeping beneath the Alaskan wilderness for millennia will finally wake up. I can hear it calling now, that deep rumbling beneath the earth. It's time for me to take my place among the frozen watchers, to become part of the message that stretches across the last frontier. Dawn, come looking for me. And if you see me standing in the storm, encased in ice with my face frozen in terror, just remember that I tried to warn you. The pattern is almost complete, and Alaska is just the beginning.